Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new malicious compliance stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
First one is titled, Women Can't Pray, but the verses you gave me say otherwise. I was sitting here reading some outrageous comments on Facebook that had to do with the beliefs of Church of Christ and their followings, and it reminded me that I had another story I had mentioned in my previous entry. So here it is. This will be long, and sorry if I ramble, it all has to do with the story. For context, this happened my senior year of high school, and I was 17. I was always a year younger than most my classmates due to a late birthday. Now I'm going to preface this again in reminding that I have health conditions that make my memory spotty at best. But this one is a favorite story of mine, as it was a real turning point for me in terms of standing up for myself and against overzealous religious people. I had moved schools from public to private halfway into my junior year. During this time I was devoutly Christian, Southern Baptist. I loved my little hidden in the woods church and was the female lead in my youth group. When I got into the school I wasn't aware it was Church of Christ based, so it was a hard clash. For those who aren't familiar, religious sects really don't get along in their beliefs. Church of Christ don't believe in using instruments, women leaders, and really follow anything a group of older men get together once a month to decide is law. This is in my experience. As a Baptist I was used to jamming out, being asked to pray before the congregation as a youth, etc. I'm also going to say I never approved of having Bible classes in a non-elective school setting. In my senior year my physics book was special made to include prayers and tried desperately to tie in God in everything we learned. In junior year my anatomy teacher couldn't even say the male reproductive part and was blushing and scolding me when I just said it. It was hilarious. Anyways, senior year we had the preacher of the church who basically funded the school as our Bible teacher. I was always at odds with him. He made the mistake of saying he loved having debates with his students. Something he made a rule against in his syllabus the next year my friends showed me, because I questioned him and had my own verses as backup. See, my own church was training me to be a youth leader and used their funds to help with it. I was well versed in the Bible. Every single time I spoke up and disagreed, he lowered my grade to failing for the day. And every time my mum would go up to the school to our counselor, we had no principal, it was a tiny private school, my graduating class was 14, and got it raised to at least a C, so my hatred for this guy was already down-packed. The main problem was that from the beginning he separated seating and had the boys sit on one side and girls on the other with 2 rows between us. He would ask us different questions, use different verses, even say different things and had different meanings based on our gender. The real problem? He only asked guys to pray before leaving class. I get it now, it wasn't that big of a deal, but being a devout teen this always irked me, but I hated having C's in classes, so I had stopped talking. Until one day the guys of the class approached me with a proposition. Next class, will you ask to pray? We are sick of doing it and don't think it's right he leaves the girls out. See, they knew that the other girls would never do it being in the same denomination, but me? They knew I was itching for another battle with this man. Next class comes along and he asks which guy would like to pray. Yes, he would be specific, and I raised my hand. Sir, I really feel like God is speaking to me to do today's prayer. May I? He gives me this "are you kidding me" look and flat out tells me, "Op, you know I only want the guys to pray in here." Well, why? I asked, bracing myself. Because men are the leaders and I should be training them as such. Leaders for the church, their families, and their peers, he said proudly. I pray all the time over my peers in my church, I respond, feeling myself tear up as confrontation was not my strong suit. Well, that's your church, this is mine. So that's that, he replies. You could just say you're sexist and get it over with. The class was in shock. The girls next to me were smugly saying he wasn't sexist, it's just how it is. Some of the boys were holding back laughter. The preacher looked angry before stating it was biblical. Oh, I knew I had him now. I demanded he give me the Bible verses that said women aren't allowed to pray out loud or over their peers, and he gives me 3 before praying himself, and we all leave to homeroom. I'm start to cry and the boys all give me side hugs, church hugs as we called them, saying that went way better than they hoped and that one of them wrote down the verses. So we went and looked them up. Here is where it becomes malicious compliance. Now I don't remember the exact verses, but all of them had exact guidelines for me to follow for me to be able to be appropriate to pray in public. Now every day we had chapel for a few minutes before lunch or next classes, and it was I think a week later when I was able to use his own verses to comply. Chapel was being led by our head counselor and luckily our Bible teacher that day. And everything fell into place. The counselor said, "Let's have a senior pray before we leave." I grinned as I went down my checklist and flipped up my hood on my hoodie and raised my hand, proudly yelling, "I'm ready now." They both looked at me, the preacher angry again, but the counselor was amused, having already been told by me what had happened, as he was a chill guy and he asked after the preacher talked to him about it. Of course he reprimanded for calling him sexist, but I didn't get into any real trouble. Anyways, the preacher had a sudden look of shock as I grinned directly at him as I pointed to my covered head, showing I read his 3 verses and was maliciously complying to them. Be with peers or among other women, check. Have seniority and a request, check. Have your head covered, check. So unless he wanted to get caught in a loop of, oh that's not what that meant, I was finally allowed to pray. From then on he prayed after every class ended and didn't bother asking because I always had a hood of some kind just in case. Ironically, this school was a huge reason I turned from being a Christian due to bullying and outrageous rich people entitlement, and I hear they are shutting down. They wanted so bad to be a family but kicked students out that needed family the most, even going so far as planting vodka in someone's locker. Good riddance. Next one is titled, Clock Out for Lunch. So my boss is not a nice person. Up until now, we haven't had any scheduled lunches but usually just eat on our feet when we get a second during the day. No one's complained and it's worked out. Well, she comes in a few weeks complaining that no one is clocking out for lunches. I got excited thinking we'd actually get a lunch break, so I asked what time she wants me to put it on the schedule for everyone. She said, "Oh no, just when you eat your lunch, you need to be clocked out. We need a half an hour a day." Well, this is not going to work. People literally go to their bags, take a few bites, and get back to work while chewing. This new rule makes it so everyone could choose to take their lunch break at any time. Also for me, even if I go sit down, if the phone rings or someone comes in, I stop eating and take care of what they need. But she wants us to clock out. So today, I clocked out for a lunch break and went upstairs. The phone rang, I ignored it, I heard people come in, not my problem, I'm on break. It wasn't until she came up and saw the chaos that I heard her ask, "Where is Banter World?" She finally found me upstairs and I told her I was clocked out for my lunch break. She was upset and I explained that you wanted us to clock out for a half an hour and I didn't have time earlier so I was doing it now. She told me that I could come back up but needed to help the people that came in. I told her that I clocked out for my lunch break. I would like to say this story ended with an actual, scheduled break throughout the day, but no. She said we just don't have to clock out anymore. Next one is titled, My Mum Ends Up Ruining the Life of Her Ex-Boss After an Exit Interview. This happened about 30 odd years ago, and my mother recounted it recently during a family dinner. So back in the 1990s my mum worked for this big-time company, we'll call it Company W, as an accountant. Her boss, the head of finance, was a sleazy guy, and despite being semi-wealthy, it was a big company, and married with kids, he always tried to pick up younger women in the office. Eventually, after a few years, my mum, being the amazing accountant that she is, noticed small irregularities in several statements. I don't know the technical terms, but mum realized that someone was embezzling the company's money for at least a couple decades. Concerned, she brought it up to the head of finance, who proceeded to demean her, call her names, botch her claim and basically threatened to fire her if she brought it up again. My mother is not one to start crying, and instead sought to prove him wrong. However, a couple of months later head of finance brought in a new lady, young, she was legit blonde, fresh out of college, to train under mum. My mother instantly knew what this was, and started putting out feelers for a new job. In the meanwhile she trained the younger lady, who, to quote my mum, was not the brightest bulb. Now, Company W had a policy when an employee was going to be fired. If the employee was being fired for reasons other than rule breaking, violations, etc., they would be allowed to say that they quit to be able to give their week's notice and get pay. A fair policy. So one day Mum was summoned by head of finance and told that he was firing her. She quickly counteracted and used the policy to her advantage, which angered head of finance, but he had to comply. The malicious compliance I know you're waiting for. Head of finance told my mother in a rather rude way that since she was going about it that way, she might as well do an exit interview. My mother literally had a lightbulb moment, and said to him that in that case, she would. To note, an exit interview is a formal way of leaving a job, akin to an interview for getting the job. It's a way for employees to share their experience, and why they're leaving for records, including HR, human resources. You can see where this is going. So, she was scheduled for the exit interview. When she went in, my mother had to, of course, bring in files relating to her work. I can't recall the exact reason, other than it having to be relevant to her reason for leaving, and show it to the interviewer. My mum brought in 3 large boxes of files, each one containing evidence of the embezzlement. She then presented it to the interviewer, who my mother told me was rather stunned, and proceeded to hand over all the evidence and proceed with her exit, including talking about the head of finance's reaction and how not long after the new lady was brought in to replace her. Mum then left the company that day, got new employment, and moved on. It was a decade later that she learned what happened. My dad was a delivery driver at the time and actually made a delivery to Company W. While there, he talked with an employee, mentioned my mum had worked there and how she left, and the employee told him quite the juicy story. In the year following my mother's departure and interview, her evidence was brought to HR and the CEO, who ordered an internal investigation. Hidden cameras were placed in the accounting division, every file made was screened and photocopied, tiny details scrutinized and bank records triple-checked. I think you can see where this is going. Yup, the head of finance was embezzling from Company W, but it gets better. They got him, on camera, making out with the new lady inside the main office after hours. To add insult to injury, the cameras also caught him being cruel to those under him, touching other women, etc. But the biggest thing was still the embezzlement. Head of finance managed to, in over 30 years, steal over $1 million in Company W's earnings. From his days as a mere accountant and all through his promotions. Now the exact way he was able to get that much over time wasn't told to my dad. I doubt the employee knew, but he did know the fallout. Head of finance was summoned to the Big Cheese's office the day after the evidence was complied, and let's just say head of finance wished he had simply been fired. He was arrested for the embezzlement, and for sexual misconduct or something like that, as well as a few other things my mum can't recall. The new lady who came in actually revealed that he had brought her in after starting to date her and even revealed to her what he was doing. Her job basically had been to help him cover it up so they could live the rich life. She didn't even know what exactly accounting was, other than managing money. The perfect cover, so to speak. And if the now ex-head of finance thought being arrested and charged was bad enough, when his wife found out. The employee who told my dad this hadn't been present when the wife had come in while the ex-head of finance had been let out, but a friend of his had seen what happened. She had just went up, smacked the now ex-head of finance, screamed obscenities at him, before saying she'll be seeing him in court for a divorce. While my dad couldn't learn what exactly happened next, what was clear was that the guy's life was ruined. And my mum, while not a vindictive person by any means, did feel somewhat joyful over the outcome. Lesson to be learned here: never screw with an accountant who actually knows what they're doing. Next one is titled, "Want to know how that machine works?" At the store where I worked in sales, I had been reprimanded for being chatty with the customers. It's sales. We had a daily morning meeting where I paid intense attention as it was where products were introduced as well as programs and processes. At the end of the week there was an informal quiz to recap and verbally test your recall and retention. While the manager conducted the meeting, an employee got up to make a pot of coffee and filled a pot and dumped it in the top of the machine. I tried to stop her, but was told to stop talking as she certainly knew how to make coffee. I did as was told and buttoned it quietly, waiting for the machine to overflow by 1 coffee pot of water, diluting the coffee made. If I had been allowed to tell her the machine had a designated water line, but no, so I watched the ruckus and ensuing cleanup in which I did not participate. At this same company, the same manager was instructing employees how to count my section of the stockroom, when I chimed in cautioning them not to push the merch back as it would fall between the shelves and is time-consuming to retrieve. I was once again shushed and was later told by the stockroom manager that the exact thing happened and you don't go home until all counts are reconciled. Searching for difficult-to-reach product is just what you don't want to be doing after midnight on the longest workday of the year. Too bad, I had already left and she now couldn't. Next one is titled, Formulaic Decrease Inefficiency. I'm working as a pentester for a large financial company. In this job, we need to get elevated permissions on some systems to do our tests. This has to be issued for the time these tests run and of course tracked and everything. This was something that was usually done by us sending a list of the servers and the permissions we need to the network guys, who then did their magic to give us permissions. That system worked pretty well. We had our server lists ready and basically just sent the relevant lists with a quick note when and how long we need it to the networkers, who were used to us sending this and developed a good routine. Mostly they just switched rules back on that already existed, just checking the lists we sent for changes. Took us about 10 minutes to check whether the lists are still up to speed and correct them, and the networkers had about 15 minutes of work to set everything the way it needed to be. 30 minutes of work, including coffee break, everyone was happy. It worked perfectly. Now, to streamline and increase productivity, that alone should tell you that BS is afoot. The system got automated recently. In a form, you can now shop the permissions you need. You just put down the server, the ports, duration, reason, your laughs, your cries, your hopes, your dreams, your shoe size and that of your superior into a form, and then you get everything automatically. Read, the networker gets it and then has to do it manually because, well, guess at what part security management asked them if they're nuts to just let anyone decide what rights they want. So far, so good. We were, well, let's say not too excited about it, mostly about the form's rather awkward style. After a lengthy discussion with the person responsible for it, who doesn't exactly like us pentesters because we think that everything has to go the way we want and we only want to play by our rules and can't just do our job, his words, paraphrased, we were told in no uncertain terms that simply sending the network guys a list is not going to do it and we will use the form. It only takes a minute, damn it, how spoiled can we be? Can we charge that minute it takes us on your department? Yes? Well, okay, then we don't really have a problem anymore. It only takes a minute. Pretty exactly a minute, actually, give or take, depending on how responsive the server is that hosts the form and how quickly you can type in your stuff. But, and that is the problem, you can only put in demands for yourself, not others, and for one server at a time. This is for most users not that big of a problem, since they generally only need to work with one server at a time. During a test, especially when targeting a semi-large server farm as we are about to, this can be a few more machines and, as you may imagine, a few more people. Or, in this particular case now, precisely 782 systems and 12 people. 782 times 12 minutes, now that we're streamlined and productive, compared to 30 minutes back in our old, sluggish and inefficient days. So we are using the form. After all, we have an account we can charge with the time we spend on the form. A recent poll among my coworkers said that we clocked about 80 hours on it so far. But I have already almost 400 machines down, and so do most of the others, so we should not stress his budget with more than 5 figures when we're done with the machines for this test, at least. Not the test itself, mind you. 5 figures for red tape. Plus, and this just for the network and firewall people reading here, can you imagine the difference in workload and stress on the firewalls when they need one rule per server instead of being able to do subnet-based rules where multiple servers get handled by one rule? I have a hunch that we'll be back to our old ways no later than when he gets the numbers for this month from accounting. Or when the firewallers start screaming because their walls melt under the workload. Let's see what happens first. Last on is titled, 30 minutes for lunch break. I drive a semi-truck for a local company. We get 30 minutes taken out of our work hours whether we eat lunch or not. This rule is hidden behind the hazy shadow of rules to keep my company compliant. Ruler, every employee gets 30 minutes for lunch. Rule B, you are not to take a company truck out to any fast food restaurant, only gas stations. Rule C, if you take your personal vehicle to eat lunch, you must clock out. See where this last rule means up to 1 hour of lunch time, even if you only take your 30? Yeah, screw this. I know, this is for insurance purposes in case you get into a wreck. However, your 30 minutes is automatically removed from your time every day regardless if you get lunch or not. So, I follow the rules. I do not clock out for lunch. I go where I wish to eat. Granted, I am not pulling a 53-foot trailer when I do so. I bobtail to wherever I wish, and let's say I am somewhere where I am not supposed to be during normal working hours, I simply claim that I am on lunch. These hours have never been defined for lunch. I sit at KFC or Burger King while watching the main office cater inexpensive restaurant foods every day. Thanks for listening.